Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schaede, professor and director of JFIT here at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. We have a full house today, while some of our participants are still finding their Zoom seats. Let me just give you a little bit of background of who we are and where we are. Today, of course, is April 30th, 2024, 4 p.m. in California, which makes it May 1 in Japan. Happy May 1st, everybody. Ohayo gozaimasu to Japan. Today, we will do a little bit something different. I will be in the hot seat today because we're discussing my new book with Nobuyuki Oishi, who will become the moderator of today's session. So I'm very much looking forward to this. This event finds you at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We have roughly 400 students, 40 faculty, and 8 degrees. We actually have exactly 8 degrees. And one of them is a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our offerings, please visit us at gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Forum of Innovation and Technology, our Japan Center, where we're having a lot of fun and trying to connect Southern California with Japan. You can follow us on LinkedIn and X, I guess it's called now. Please note that our events are recorded. There are two implications to this. The first is that if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box. It may be that today we're not necessarily able to get to your Q&A. So if so, please still type them in and I will review them after the event and see whether I can answer per email. The second implication is that we have a set of recordings and we host those in what's called the JZ Gallery. You can find links to past events at jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar. And here is what's coming up. So today, of course, we have Oishi-san, and we're going to talk about my new book. But listen up, everybody. In 2 weeks from now, I'll have Shikata-san with me. He is what we would call the press secretary to Prime Minister Kishida. So we'll hear directly from the Cabinet Office building in a conversation with the Cabinet Secretary for Public Affairs. And then on May 28th, we'll have Masakazu Masujima, who is a lawyer, a legal expert on Japanese finance. And we will talk about cryptocurrency in Japan, a hot item that I know nothing about, but we'll learn what the legal situation is about that. Okay, enough of me. People are in their seats. I'll stop my share. And so here is Oishi-san. Hello to Tokyo, Oishi-san. So let me introduce Nobuyuki Oishi, who is a Nikkei reporter. He was a student at UCSD at what was then called IRPS on our one-year executive program in 1992 to 93. At the time, Oishi-san, who was with the Nikkei then, was on the beat of Okamatsu Sozaburo, who was the Shingikan at METI at the time. And when Okamatsu-san retired, he asked Oishi-san, where should I go post-retirement? And thank you, Nobuyuki, for telling him to, of course, come to IRPS. And so from that has grown a wonderful tradition of hosting a lot of government officials and students from the government here. So after coming back from UCSD, and then some years later, Oishi-san moved to Nikkei X, which was a startup initiative, and then TV, and he's now in charge of art exhibitions, and he earned a Master's of Art lately, which is also a whole different conversation that we should have at some point. But enough of me. So Oishi-san, let me just pass the microphone to you. You'll take over, and I'll become the guest. So.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to the Japan Zoomina. It's a great honor to join this Zoomina because I'm an alumni of UC San Diego GPS. So anyway, so today's topic will book, but before that, let me introduce myself a little bit. I'm a senior producer at Nikkei. I've worked as a newspaper and television journalist for over 30 years. I used to be a newscaster at the World Business Satellite of TV Tokyo and financial news program of Nikkei CNBC. That's why you asked me to become a moderator today. I don't know. Currently, I'm in charge of organizing art exhibitions. Japan is unique in the global art scene in that the newspaper companies play a major role in organizing art exhibitions. Next year, Nikkei will host an exhibition from the San Diego Museum of Art. Anyway, I believe Ulrike invited me this time because a conversation between us was one of the reasons for her new book today, which is today's topic. She and I had lunch just over a year ago when she came to Japan. At that time, we talked about her previous book, The Business Reinvention of New Japan. I argued that more Japanese readers should read that book, which spotlights the strengths of Japanese companies despite Japanese people's strong pessimism about the future. I strongly suggest that the book should be published as a Japanese paperback version of Shinsho, which could be easily read by business people in Japan rather than a hardcover book. With this background, I'm delighted that this book was published last month. I feel like an uncle who is happy about the birth of a new child in his family. I hope this book will be a bestseller because it contains several powerful words that Japanese readers may be interested in, such as Japan Inside, Slow is not bad, There's hope for Japan, Minority Strategy, Don't copy Silicon Valley, and so on. Let me show you an example of Japan Inside. Nikkei reporters disassembled Apple's new headset device, Vision Pro. They found that Japanese companies are its leading component suppliers, accounting for 42% of the parts on a cost basis. Japanese component suppliers play a major role in cutting-edge products such as Vision Pro. In other words, there will be no innovation without Japanese companies. Before she gives her presentation of her book, I'd like to comment on the book's title. The Japanese title of this book is Shin Nihon no Kei, Hikan Bias Haisu. The literal translation in English is Shin Management in Japan, eliminating the pessimism bias. Shin is a word that has only recently come into use and cannot be translated into English, so I have left it as Shin. This Shin is said to have been invented by anime director Hideaki Anno. The new usage became popular with the success of Shin Godzilla and Shin Evangelion, the films he directed. As you know, many kanji have the same reading, but completely different meanings. For example, the Shin in Godzilla is said to overlap the different meanings, shake, God, and true. Like Shin Godzilla, Ulrike's book also seeks to shake up and awaken the Japanese people who have shrunk over the long period of what is called the lost 30 years. The book also tried to eliminate the pessimistic bias and portray the true Japan. Kanji, which sounds Shin, also has the meaning of new. I could say that her book is also new in the sense that it introduces new aspects of Japanese companies. I'd like to add one more kanji to her book. This is Shin here, which means to grow. I mentioned earlier that Shin in Godzilla also means God. I think her book also has the meaning of God. I'd like to explain that after Ulrike's presentation. Now, Schaede Sensei, please introduce your book now.
Okay, so if you can stop your share, then I will start mine. I brought just a few images. I'll try to do this fairly quickly. So, so as you mentioned, Oishi-san, the origins of of this book was actually the previous book, right? Which I wrote for the American audience with a due date of June 2020 to be published in time for the Tokyo Olympics. And I managed to do that, but the Olympics, of course, didn't happen. In any event, it got translated nevertheless into Saiko Zekaisha. And that is this big hardcover book that you just mentioned that that maybe you mentioned it's too complicated. And so write a short book. And so in that sense, Oichi-san, you're really the uncle of, or one of the originators of this idea. And so here it is. It currently only exists in Japanese. And I am thinking of self-publishing it on Amazon or something radically new and fast. And if so, it will look like something like this. So the original title that I had for it in English is Japan Reemerges. Saifujo is the Japanese for reemergence. And so the Japanese publisher, Nikkei, said, well, yeah, I don't know about Saifujo. And so we actually have to ask them, what they meant by the Shin, God or something, I don't know. But anyway, so here are the main 4 points that the book makes. Yes, the 10 years after the bubble were a bad time for Japan. So to recover from the financial crisis after the bubble burst was bad. But the subsequent 20 years were not lost. There were not stagnation. There were 20 years of system transformation. In that period, Japan's leading companies have reemerged, or since over this period, have reemerged as leaders in something that I call Japan Inside, which is what you just mentioned with the goggles. I'll say a little bit more about that momentarily. The book then describes what these leading companies are doing as the Mai no Umi strategy. So we'll do a little bit of sumo. And then in the book, I won't have time for this today, but I actually introduce the research I've done between 2010 and 2015 or so on these leading frontrunner companies. I interviewed a large number of them and the CEOs, and I realized that they have some joint characteristics. And I end on the notion that slow is not stagnant. Slow is just slow. And so we can have a conversation about slow, and I'll end today on that note that slow is not stagnant. All right, so here's the chart that I now like to show when people say 30 years, 30 years, 30 years of stagnation. There's something called the Harvard Growth Lab, where they're a developmental economist, and they have created a ranking of the productive knowledge of a country, where they look at two things. They look at the country's export basket, and they look at how diverse and complex are the exports, and how many countries can do the same thing. So for instance, a t-shirt is not very complex. Many countries can make it, so it gets a low score. In contrast, a specialty chemical for semiconductor production is very complex. Few countries can make it, and it earns a high score. This is the Harvard Growth Lab ranking since 1995, and you guess where I'm headed with this? Yes, Japan is number one, and has been number one in terms of the complexity of its export basket over the last, ever since they constructed this. Germany and Switzerland come in at number 2 and 3, and South Korea is really the rising star here, which comes in at number 4. Just a footnote on the US at number 12. This thing measures the export basket, not IT or data centers or software as a service. So we have to be a little bit careful. And the United States, of course, exports a lot of rice and potatoes. And so it gets a somewhat lower score than we might get if we looked at the entire industrial profile. This is just the export basket. So let's not overinterpret this. But still, what this tells us is that Japanese companies are making very complex things. And we know from business theory that means that they have very complex organizations to be able to do that. I'll get back to that later. All right, so the main story here is not 3 lost decades. Yes, 1 lost decade after the bubble, but 20 years of transformation. And the reason that this transformation was necessary was that after World War II, Japanese companies caught up with the West. And so now they have caught up. They're no longer a follower, they're a leader. This has required a system transformation where Japanese companies need to be able to compete at the technology frontier, right? And so this started roughly at 2005, and this process has taken 20 years, not because somebody is incompetent or whatever, but because that was actually a choice to do this slowly. All right, so sumo is a great image for this. So let me take you to sumo. Those of you, the seasoned Japan hands on the call, will remember the bubble years and the early 90s as Konishiki and Akebono being like this really massive man. And Akebono, by the way, passed away 2 or 3 weeks ago. The New York Times had a piece on him with a quote that was, "We had no technique. We just did it with sheer power. We just pushed these guys out of the ring," right? My favorite sumo at the time was Mai no Umi, who was shorter than I am, actually. Still is shorter than I am, and a bare 100 kilos. So, whatever that is in pounds, 200, barely 200 pounds. And he won against these big guys. And the way he won, I think, is a perfect description of how Japanese companies have transformed. And by the way, they had to transform because companies from China and elsewhere will always be larger than Japanese companies, no matter how large Japanese companies want to get, right? Now, size is good, right? Power through size is fantastic. You win bouts, and that's excellent. So good for you if you have a lot of muscle, but size alone is no longer enough. Instead, Japanese companies have to become what Mai no Umi was known to be, namely the waza no depato. So waza is a sumo technique, and the Sumo Association looks at each bout and then marks how it was won. And if it was won with a particular technique, there's a name for it. It's a waza, right? And Mai no Umi had mastered 33 different waza with which he won his bouts against these, partially against these much larger competitors. And so the waza strategy for New Japan is really about being quicker, faster, smarter, and create surprise movements at the technology frontier, right? And that requires a change in the identity of the company, and that is what has taken time for these large companies. So here's the evidence that this is already happening. This may look a little daunting, but let me put my laser thing on. Oh, there it is. So what we have on these bubble charts, these are produced by METI and NEDO, and they picked 2 industries, mainly automobiles and electronics. So this does not reflect, chemicals or construction, machinery or factory automation. These are basically automobiles and parts, and in orange and yellow, and electronics and electronic parts in blue and teal. And this is the global market, and this is the combined market share of Japanese companies. And what you see here in orange is the automobile industry, and these are hybrids. And so we know it's a huge industry, $10 trillion or so, and Japan combines to a 30% global market share in this industry. I am much more interested in these little dots here, the Milky Way on the lower right-hand side. These are input materials and parts, like the ones that Oishi-san just showed with the new Apple goggles, right? And so these are companies, or these are products or markets, right? Where Japanese companies combine to something like 100% or 80% of global market share. Let me make this a little bigger. You see some things you might expect, like sensors from Keyence, but also specialty steel from Japan Steel and so forth. So this is not an academic study. METI did not do a random sort of collection of products to assess Japan's strengths. They wanted to know, in these 1,000 global product categories in automobiles and electronics, how strong is Japan? And they found that Japanese companies combined to a 50% plus market share in 400 or so of these product categories and sensors and whatnot. And each of these is small in and of itself, about 2.5 billion, but you can do the math, times 400, 500, it adds up. Right. And so that in the English version of the book, I called that the aggregate niche, because in the aggregate, these little bubbles become big. In the Japanese version, I turned this into a Mainumi, the Waza no Repato strategy. Now you might think, well, fine, okay, I believe it, but doesn't every country have this? And the answer is no, not really. So this is South Korea, and you see here not much. Something in TVs and semiconductors here from Samsung and LG, right? This is Taiwan, a lot of semiconductor teal, but nothing at the frontier in terms of dominance. Now, again, maybe there's, of course, some production techniques that the TSMC has that nobody else has, right? That may not be reflected here, but in any event, it's all teal, which is interesting. The United States has a lot of pink, which is biotech, and this teal, which is semiconductors. But also, and a few here on the 100% line. And then the biotech, of course, is explained by the fact that the regulation in the United States is less cumbersome, so it's easier to do biotech development here. And the final point on my bubbles is that this is a recent development. So this is 2006, this is 2016, and you can see a increase in my little Mainumi Waza bubbles here, right? So, so I'm not just stipulating that Japanese companies should become Mainumi strategists. This it's based. I saw this first and then deducted that that's what it is. Now, one of the wonderful things about this for Asia is that this might actually balance some of the shifting the shifts in the situation there. Power through trade creates dependencies, and so what this means is that these four players are actually sort of interdependent. I looked at trade data. This is 2018, and then came COVID. It was a little complicated, but in any event, at the time, the trade between Japan and China was roughly equal at 180 billion. But South Korea and Taiwan had a trade deficit with Japan. So South Korea and Taiwan buy chemicals, sensors, whatever materials. They then make the parts that go into the iPhone or the goggles. And then China has a trade deficit with South Korea and Taiwan. And so Japan, in a way, anchors some portions of the Northeast Asian trade. And I think that works for everybody in a way that I hope might actually be balancing. All right, so finally, and I'm looking at my watch, and I'm gonna wrap this up now. But then so even if you now say, okay, fine, I believe your story, but why would it take 20 years? And the first thing I want to point out is that that 20 years is actually not that long for this type of transformation. So you may recall that IBM went through a big transformation between something like beginning in 1995 under Lou Gerstner. It took them 10 years. So it took IBM 10 years. It has now taken Hitachi 10 years undergoing a similar transformation. It's not that slow in international comparison. 10 years is not. 20 years, a little bit slow. So we need to understand that. And so I'm going to just throw this at you here very briefly. So a little bit more careful in the book to lay this out. But my conclusion is that slow is a choice. It's a deliberate trade-off that Japanese society has taken. It is the price that Japan is willing to pay to maintain social stability during a period of transformation. So let me explain that. When the Hitachis and so forth of Japan were beginning this transformation, they could not just exit a business and lay people off because of lifetime employment. And they couldn't just merge two business and lay people off. for the same reason, right? So they had to wait for attrition and not hiring and people retiring before they actually could exit certain businesses. And this was very costly for Japanese companies. It also reduced data on labor productivity and that sort of thing. And it was something that apparently Japanese society was willing to pay this cost in return for slower GDP growth. And as you know, in the United States, presidents win or lose elections based on GDP growth. It's very important for Americans to have GDP growth. It's not so important for Japan. Throughout this period, the LDP did not lose an election. I mean, they might have lost some support, but fundamentally, Japanese society was perfectly happy with this trade-off, right? And then, of course, there is a challenge, right? And the challenge is, when is slow too slow? And that's where we get this. Okay, so there's still these old type traditional Japanese companies. By the way, that's now a slang in Japan, JTC. It's a Japanese word, JTC, and it means Japan Traditional Company, and it does not have a good meaning. It means a company that is too slow in making this transformation. It is still run by Showa type managers and so forth. In my study, I've studied mostly the ones that are making the transformation, right? But I'm, of course, totally aware that there is a part of Japanese economy that has used excuses like lifetime employment that can't change. All right, last or final slide. So Japan's transformation is often misunderstood because the story is told by American journalists or economists or Japanese people who are trained in the United States. The process of Japan's transformation is very different from what Westerners observe. And here's the hope and sort of the final ending that I wrote for the Japanese audience. And that is that what we see in Japan may be a different way of thinking about capitalism, that maybe, we don't know yet, it's not over, we're in the middle of this, but maybe if Japan can find a new balance between social stability and economic success, then that could become an example as an important alternative system. The United States is now labeled a late capitalist place, or being bankrupted by the global financial crisis and its focus on finance. Maybe Japan can offer us a new way of how to balance economic growth and social stability and technological progress and sustainability and the whole global warming thing, or corporate progress and work-life balance and employee happiness. Let me just stop there. I can come back to this pivot thing later when we come to that discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm very impressed with your phrase. So slow is choice. Yeah, before reading your book, I never thought that way. So I'd like to ask you a question, but before that, I'd like to explain that your book also has a quote meaning, and I'd like to share my screen again. Just.
We see something very artful, not surprisingly. All right, there you go.
Yeah, so please look at the obi on this book. So most Japanese books have obi, so book very bound in English for promotional purposes. On the obi of your book, Toyama-san, a well-known business executive in Japan, says, this is the 21st century version of Japan as number one. Japan as number one is a 1979 book by sociologist Ezra Vogel. And this book analyzes the factors behind the rapid growth of the Japanese economy in the post-war period and gives high marks to the Japanese style management. It became one of the triggers for Japanese people to evaluate Japan's unique economic and social systems, and has become a bestseller with over 700,000 copies sold. Kazuo Inamori-san, founder of Kyocera and KDDI, and a strong leader in restructuring the Japan Airlines, said, "This book is an eternal Bible that gives hope and courage to our people." I believe that your book, like Ezra Vogel's book, it has a potential to become a Bible. That's why I said that your book also has a meaning of God. As a first question, what do you think of Toyama-san's comment that your book is a 21st century version of Ezra Vogel's book? Do you think?
Well, I'm of course super flattered, right? I mean, I have my name in the same sentence as Professor Vogel, as mentioned like this, and kind of the obi also looks similar. And I did not notice that before, that Ezra's obi and my obi are somewhat similar there. But so the 21st century, and Toyama-san has been a great source of insights into the change that is happening in Japan and so forth. So it's very flattering and a little bit, sort of, I'm a little bit, nervous about this. But the point of the book really is that this is about a new number one. And it is not about being number one in GDP rankings. The world already has too much of everything in some ways. I mean, too many people, too much pollution, too much finance, too much pressure points. I mean, so that goes back to the balance that I was just talking about, right? So what if Japan can, and Japan's experience with this transformation can actually guide us to a new way of thinking about what really matters in an economy, and I'm thinking it's that balance, but it could be something else. It could be just happiness of people or something. That Japan could be a front runner in pointing us to a new system of capitalism that just runs a little bit more slowly, and that this slower pace, when it's too slow is an issue, right? But the slower pace takes better care of people. And so that is very flattering that Toyama-san thinks that I might be onto something with that. And that gives me hope. That gives me hope for Japan. I think the Japanese should have hope for Japan. But this when Toyama-san said that was really, really very encouraging to me that he saw it like that.
Yeah, I heard that you met Mainumi-san last week.
Yes, so this was really quite special for me. So Mainumi was really not a big sumo, as you can see here. So I'm 173 centimeters. I asked him about this how he got into, he cleared the hurdle of the sumo kai. So at the time Mainumi became a sumo, he had to be at least 173 centimeters.
Yeah,
and he wasn't. So he actually had. That's right. He had silicone inserted in his scalp to hit the hurdle. And so I asked him, and he said it was the most painful thing he has done in his entire life. And he did it to clear this Japanese hurdle. And then I said, well, but then didn't they notice after you put it back out, didn't they notice that you weren't actually that tall? And he said, no, it didn't matter. Once I was in. And I thought, I can write a whole paper about sort of, the short-sightedness of this type of regulation. But so it was very interesting to see him. If you saw him on the street in Tokyo, you would never think that he was a sumo athlete. And yet he's, of course, now the NHK newscaster, the caster who's commenting on the bouts, right? So if you watch sumo on NHK, you will hear his voice. And we had a great conversation. He got up from his seat and he showed me the waza that he invented and how he got about that. He's still very athletic. And he told me he lost about 20 kilo of just lean muscle, right? After he retired.
Did you explain your expression of the minority strategy?
Yes. So and he was, of course,
he say about
well,
the minority strategy.
He was told that some Gaijin researcher had named a strategy after him. He's very flattered and very happy, right? So it's like, okay, great. Wow, you named a strategy after me. That's very good. So I asked him about how he designed the strategy, how he would prepare for a bout against Konishiki. And there's the most famous one is the one where he just my memory may be shady, but he stepped aside or he jumped very high in any event, so it goes da 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 da, so everybody's ready, fists down, and he just stepped aside, and Konishiki's power took Konishiki out of the ring.
Yeah.
And Mainomi was just standing there. He hadn't done anything. He needed to do absolutely nothing. And that was so smart. And that became a waza.
Okay.
And the other waza he explained was that usually when they get ready to go forward, so go forward, he would just go backwards and they fall on their face. So it was a lot of fun. He showed me all of these tricks. So that was good.
I have a question about the Mainomi strategy. So Mainomi, so he is called, as you said, a department store of techniques. But he was a great sumo wrestler, but so far, we can see any Mainomi second. So no one has followed in his footsteps. So that means it must be very difficult. It must be very challenging for Japanese company to follow Mainomi strategy. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I mentioned the complexity, right? So and the slow speed at which this there's another so he somehow was able to get behind him. So the slow speed and the complexity, those go hand in hand, right? So this is very difficult. The transformation that Japanese companies are undergoing is super hard, especially in a country where people have very clear ideas of what is the right behavior and who speaks and what order and how this company is run. And so this combination of very complex technological leadership and the Japanese setting in which this is happening, it's super difficult, which is why there are currently still a lot of JTCs in Japan and only a fairly small group of these front runners. So I think that the Japanese economy right now is some version of the 2080 principle, right? Which is where 20% of input explain 80% of output. And I think the Japanese economy has been carried by these Mainomi companies. And when we look at policy measures, industrial policy or Abenomics, my interpretation of those is that they are attempts to change this to a 40-60 economy, right? And that the entire economy will become more buoyant if more companies follow the front runners. But what's important about Mainomi strategies by companies like Hitachi or Sony or Keyence or Fanuc is that they take away, so Hitachi's reformation is taking away the excuses of the JTCs. They can no longer say, but we're too old, or we're a traditional company, or we're too big, or we're too complicated, or too complex. They can't say that. If Hitachi can change, then every single Japanese company can change, right? And so in that sense, there are these leading Mainomis that are now being followed. And if I could say one more thing on that, I think the time is now for Japan for two reasons.
Yeah.
The labor shortage has arrived.
Yeah.
Companies can no longer attract talent easily. So they either do this and become an interesting place to work for with a clear vision, a clear strategy, and a clear, this is where we're going, or they will not have workers.
Okay.
And second, interest rates are going to go up. So this whole thing about banks, helping is also over. Right? So there are these two pressures. You have to be an interesting company to get talent, and you have to be profitable to get loans. And both of these are coming together in this year. So I think the year of the dragon is really going to be, an enormous year for Japan.
Okay. I understand, but many Japanese say that if you say that Japan has some hope, but I think many Japanese people say no way, it's really. And so they say that look at GDP, and it's fallen to the fourth place in the world, and because the population and Japan's total population will return to the 100 years ago in the next 100 years, and also because the current yen rapid decline. So my question is, why do Japanese people try to see the negative, not the positive side, like you? And why the Japanese so pessimistic compared to other countries? This is a recent research done by Nippon Foundation and asking about the future of the economy. So according to this survey, the percentage of young Japanese who think the country get better is very low compared to other countries. So why Japanese people are so pessimistic?
So I think if you hear a story often enough, you eventually believe it's true, right? And so the story of the 30 lost years, the 3 stagnant decades, the American story, which is GDP centered and not transformation centered, is just, we've heard it so often. But it's really like if you ask my brother what kind of person I am, and my brother will give you a story, right? But if you ask me, I can give you another story of who I am. And so in a way, I think that Japan just has not told its own story in a very successful way, right? It's the American story, which is centered on GDP and labor productivity. On the GDP data, Japan is only the 12th largest country in the world, right? So it's still doing fine, but who cares about GDP? I mean, yes, we care about GDP. We care about growth, right? But or the absolute size of it might also be important, right? Because when I want to shrink, but the two actually go together, right? So the shrinking population and a stagnant GDP still means that GDP per capita has not declined in a similar way. There's also some exchange rate noise there about Japan falling to fourth, and Germany has long benefited from the Eurozone, right? So we have to be a little bit careful. But overall, you're right? So Japan is not, as big as China. This is the whole story. Japan will never be as big as China, so it needs to go for the Maino-umi strategy as a country, right? But that doesn't mean. But size is just such a difficult thing. Well, why don't we look at other things to measure? And I've actually asked my economist colleagues here at GPS, so why are you so concerned with GDP growth? And one of them looked at me and smiled and said, "Well, that's the only thing we can measure."
Okay.
We can't measure the quality of a subway or the quality of a safe society or the dollar value of a stable political system or the dollar value of a country that has no crime. They don't know how to measure that, so they measure GDP. And I think it's time that we rethink this a little bit and it's difficult to measure. Right? This is the problem with the new Japan as number one. We don't know how to assess that.
Okay. So my next question is about the future of Japan. So Japan seems to have an 80-year cycle. In 1867, Edo shogunate returned power to the emperor. And for the next 40 years, Japan rose to the point of competing with the world power. However, it fell after winning the Russian-Japanese War and defeated in World War II. Then Japan's post-war economic growth began, but peaked with bubble economy and entered a long period of decline. And it seems that it's now at the bottom and will come out of it. So in the past, the rising phase is mainly about catching up with world powers in military and economic power. But I think the next 40 years will be different. And what will be the next 40 years? So what should they be? How about
We don't know.
you don't know?
I'm not sure. I'm a strong believer in this sort of historical determinism, but it's like it's nice. I mean, I hope this is true. It could be.
But you said that Japan could be a new leader, so balancing the social stabilities and the economic growth. So Japan can present something new style to the world. So
Right. But this again shows some sort of economic measure, right? So this is like again measured in some sort of GDP or something. And I'm wondering whether, this could also happen. But by the way, the stock market already knows my story, right? I mean, they're faster than I am. The stock market in Japan is back to pre-bubble burst levels for a reason, and it's not just the exchange rate, right? The people know what's happening in Japan, and this transformation is happening. And the company I'm studying have seen nice increases in stock price and so forth. So some of these measures might still apply, and I really think so. So I just got back from Japan, as you mentioned, and I'm sensing a different sentiment among people that the time is now. It's going to. I mean, maybe it's it's either going to go upward or we're toast regardless. But I think there's a new sort of optimism in the air that, in spite of all the global challenges that we're facing, that this might actually happen. But we don't know, right? It would be nice, wouldn't it? If more Japanese companies could just overcome this this inertia, maybe that they're still kind of sort of sitting in, and follow the front runners into this new shift.
Yeah. So let me move on to the next question. And can you hear the sound? No.
No, unfortunately, we can't.
Okay.
I'd like to thank.
So do you remember?
Yes, I do remember this. That was a very exciting moment. That was City Tech Tokyo, which was exactly a year ago, I think, which is actually when we had this conversation about this new book.
Yeah, you look like a rock star at the time. And you gave the speech at the summit organized by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government to promote entrepreneurs. And as you know, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government has set a goal to increase the number of unicorns from Tokyo by 10 times in 5 years. However, you state in your book that increasing the number of unicorns is not a good fit for Japan, which contradicts the intention of the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, which invited you to the conference. And could you explain why you think the Silicon Valley entrepreneurship model is not good fit for Japan?
So Silicon Valley is very shiny from far away, right? It looks beautiful with all of these startups and the innovation. When you get a little bit closer, it's not nearly as beautiful. There are lots of failures, of course. Normally people say it's like 1 in 10 VC investments makes it, right? So that means 90% of startups in Silicon Valley fail, and only a handful make it to become big, like Google, which, by the way, just turned 25 years old. So right, so the big Silicon Valley companies are no longer startups at all. That's another That's another challenge. But the unicorn challenge in particular is a matter of definition. I think having a goal, like we want successful startups, that's a great idea, right? So that's why I was invited to speak at the City Tech event. But the definition of a unicorn should be country specific. So in the United States, the origins of the unicorn is that it was some venture capitalists who looked at them and looked, are they worth more than $1 billion? How many, right? And so it's a very small number. And so he called those unicorns because that's a rare animal. And in Japan, valuations are just not like that. The Japanese stock market does not have valuations like that. So to set a goal of having 100 companies valued over $1 billion, that's just setting companies up to fail, because that's just not how the Japanese stock market works. And I would say it's a good thing that the Japanese stock market doesn't work like that. But that's for a different day, maybe. How about a different definition of success for a Japanese startup, right? I mean, it's difficult. I have no good answer, but it could be employment, because that's something Japan likes and values, right? So a company that grows from 0 employees to 20 employees in a certain period of time, that's a success. Or it could be something else, like, I don't know, sales or something that speaks to the Japanese mind as a success measure. And I just don't think that $1 billion valuation is something that speaks to the Japanese society as a success.
All right. Okay. So finally, I'd like to suggest the following books for you to publish a Japanese leader in the future. I have 3 titles. And the first one is the enigma of Japanese pessimism. Why are the Japanese so pessimistic? New rules for becoming the world's happiest country. As mentioned earlier, most surveys show that Japanese are pessimistic about the future. I'd like to see your analysis of why the Japanese are pessimistic, whether the pessimistic attitude of Japanese people is just a trend of the last 30 years, or whether it comes from a social structural problem. I would also be interested in your analysis of the impact of Japanese pessimism on corporate management. And the second one is Bible of 21st century entrepreneurship. Don't copy Silicon Valley. The book with the title textbook in books with the word textbook in title are big sellers in Japan. That's true. Suppose you could propose a Japanese way of entrepreneurship in an easy to understand way. In that case, I think it would be a handy book, especially for young people trying to start their businesses. And the third one is New Japan's Leadership, the world's strongest leadership made possible by Japan. You say that Japan can show leadership by introducing new capitalism to the world. Japan's GDP has dropped to the 4th place and will soon be overtaken by India to 5th place. I have a feeling that many people believe that Japan is not qualified to be a leader because it will no longer have the economic strength. So that has been the source of Japan's strength in the past. If you can break through this common belief and show that Japan has a potential to be a future leader and what Japan's new leadership should be, I think this book will sell very well. So how about this?
Wow. So Oishi-san just jumped this on me as a surprise. So I think these are 3 great ideas. You should co-author them with me, because certainly the first one, right? I don't know why there's such a pessimism. So at one level, this whole self-effacing, self-deprecating herikudaru of Japan is, of course, an absolutely wonderful and admirable personal trait, right? What's not to like about modest people that are humble about their accomplishments? The challenge with Japan's pessimism today, I think, I'm not even sure it's more, Japanese are more pessimistic than they were, 50 years ago. I don't think that. But the challenge is that it's now translated, through DeepL and whatnot, into other languages. And so when there's some self-deprecating, oh, we Japanese don't know how to be innovative, or we don't know how to, that gets translated into English. And again, if you hear it often enough, or you see it often enough in the newspapers, it kind of becomes the truth, and then it creates this feedback loop. So so I think there's something about maybe the way in which some communications should change. You can't change deep-seated attitudes like that, and there's nothing wrong with being humble and modest, right? But maybe there could be a different style of communication to the world of what Japan represents. And I do like your obi there. That's really very artistic. The don't copy Silicon Valley. I think I should write that. That's a great idea. Let me get right to that. And then the last one, I think that could be very interesting, is kind of what can the world learn from Japan? And that's actually something I'm thinking about. Let me give you just one example. I remember 20 years ago, there was this whole sort of very negative coverage of Japan and the hikikomori, the young Japanese that would lock themselves up in their rooms, and often they were otaku or something that also became a bad word. I don't know why. And they would just lock themselves up, and their parents would bring them something to eat. And this has become a global phenomenon. Japan was just 20 years early. Likewise, at around the 2010s, there was this whole big research in Japan about young people living with their parents, in Tokyo in particular. And there was a label by a Todai professor about parasite youngsters or something, which never sat right with me. I thought there was actually really bad characterization of what's happening, because I just felt that these young people didn't have the money to rent their own apartment. Now, guess what? 15 years later, we see this in the United States. More and more parents in their 50s suddenly have their kids back home, because rents are crazy, certainly in San Diego and the Bay Area. So there is this notion of, is some of the stuff that we've seen in Japan over the last 20 years just an early bird version, like a harbinger version of some of the societal challenges that other countries are facing. So I'm gonna definitely think about that third one in more detail. And so thank you for these great suggestions. These are wonderful. I shall tell my publisher all about them.
So I also add one more proposal. It's from Gary,
Okay. Our alum Gary. Yes.
Yeah. His suggested title is Japan as number 5.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, that could be a good one too. And I think there could be some pride associated with that as well. Because so small is beautiful has also some connotations. Well, I'm watching the clock, and I know that a lot of our audience actually structure this from 8 to 9 because in Japan, or 4 to 5 here, and then they move on to whatever else is on their calendars. And you, Oishi-san, too, want to celebrate May 1 and Golden Week. So let me wrap it up here, and thank you for all the effort you put into, especially these book covers. They all look great. So thank you very much. And thank you for joining me on this. And most importantly, thank you for suggesting that I write this Shincho. It was a difficult experience to write for the Japanese audience and focus on a readership that I don't know how familiar I'm with. So I have some assumptions about them.
Yeah,
I hope, that was great.
Yeah. I hope that one of my suggestions will be published as a book in the future, and I will be happy. So if I'll be able to speak with you at the Japan Zoom again.
Great. Thank
Yeah.
you very much. And
Thank
thank
you
you,
very much.
everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Let me remind you that Shikata Noriyuki is going to be with me in 2 weeks from now to tell us all about Prime Minister Kishida's plans for Japan. So I'll see you then. And until then, please stay safe and enjoy Golden Week if you're in Japan, and spring if you're in the United States.